The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Looking forward to working with you for the next 45 minutes to an hour. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could I ask you just to go to the question box just on the right hand side? Could you just type in the word clear? That just lets me know that I am being heard, and that is important obviously because I don't want to be spending a lot of time talking to myself. Thanks Jay, and hi Jay, welcome. Thanks Phil, welcome again. Thanks, John, and welcome. Thanks, Marianne. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Thanks, Joe. Welcome to today. Okay, it looks like I am coming across loud and clear, and there are a few more people coming into the room now. So welcome, everybody. And we're up to unit number 4, as you can see on your screen, and we're going to talk about getting the very best from the people you lead, which is not always a simple thing, and I'm sure you're aware of that. And I want to share with you a number of different frameworks, models, processes that I think I know work really well. And so really your homework is to try the ones that you like and go out and give it a shot. And of course, the normal process, I'd really encourage you to ask questions, to make comments, give your thoughts and feelings on any topic, but do it as it comes up. And just like you typed in the word clear there, all you've got to do, of course, is to type in your message. Now, I'm the only one that gets to see the message, and of course, I'll respond to it the moment I see it. You'll get a copy of the slides and the recording as per usual at the end of this webinar, this broadcast. So you can see we're we're halfway through. We're a bit over halfway through, and our topic today is very much looking at getting the best from people that you lead. So let's get underway. Now, I would argue that your job as a leader is, and I say the word leader because this is a little bit different from management. I would say your job as a leader ultimately is about getting the very best from the people that you lead. And I hope you agree with me. That's not a very easy thing to do, I admit that. And of course, when we look at engagement levels in the workplace, it makes it even more difficult. But I think there's a few principles that I would share with you that I think work really well. I think the first thing I would say to you is that if you could rate your people on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the level of performance, and let's say you had somebody with a 7 out of 10, somebody with a 6 out of 10, and somebody with a 5 out of 10, just as an example. Now, with that rating, it may not be realistic to get them to a 10 out of 10, but it's certainly realistic to get them from a 5 to a 6, or a 6 to a 7, or a 7 to an 8. That is quite realistic, and that's the way I want you to look at this topic. So it's all about getting a small amount of discretionary effort from each person that actually that's a direct report of yours. Now, if you do that, then you will find that you will gain enormous performance gains in your team just by small efforts in areas. And I think that's the way I'd look at it, because otherwise what happens is you get quite disheartened and you think, well, I'm never going to get this person from a 4 to a 10. It may well be true that that's the case, but it's certainly possible to get them from a 4 to a 5. So I want you to think about it that way. I think that's an important starting point today. All right, so look, there are a number of things that I want to cover today. I want to look at some of the myths around motivation. I think there is a lot of misleading information out there about motivation and even what the term motivation actually means. So I want to share that with you, and then I want to share with you some very interesting research where 9,000 employees were asked what they wanted in their job, and these employees crossed all boundaries. They crossed all geographical boundaries, all industry boundaries. We had people in the private sector, the public sector, and not-for-profit. So it would be very important to find out what they think. And then, of course, the key thing is to create the environment for those sorts of things to flourish as best you can. I want to talk about the concept of job and non-job roles as well. And you may not have heard of the term non-job roles, but they are critically important to your success as a leader. And I'll share with you what they are and perhaps give you some thoughts around how you might actually improve those sorts of tasks. And then, of course, I'll share some models, as I mentioned, around motivation that I think are well worth considering and applying in your own particular way. So we've got a fairly busy schedule to cover, so let's get underway. Now, let me talk about motivation on this busy slide that I've just put up there now. And in the middle there, you can see that there's a definition of motivation. Let me just read that through to you. So motivation is the forces within the individual that account for the level, direction, and persistence of effort expended at work. Now, the important thing about that is that it's forces within, and this is what we call intrinsic motivation. So it's about getting people to do things because they want to do it rather than because they're forced to do it. The other important point in the definition is that there's three dimensions to motivation. There's level, direction, and persistence. So when you look at someone in your team and you say, well, they're not motivated, a much deeper question is, which of those dimensions are they not motivated in? So let's just talk about those for a moment and consider this. So if we start at the top, direction is really the person's choice about where they spend their time. So given a choice, and many of us, of course, are absolutely flat strapped. We've got lots of things going on in our life. But really, we have a choice about where we spend our time in lots of cases. Obviously, if you're a meeting, you don't get a choice. But in many cases, we do. And so one of the dimensions of motivation that needs to be considered is, are people spending the right time in the right place, in the right way, with the right resources? And so one of the dimensions of motivation is people's focus, or as I say here, direction. So obviously people can be working flat out, they can be persistent, they can be quite intense. But of course, if they're working on the wrong things, then that's problematic. So for example, a salesperson, you would argue, should be working on sales most of the time. But if they're working on other things, then they're not being effective, regardless of how effective they're being at these other things. The other thing that's important is persistence. Now, persistence is, of course, how long people stick at something. This is stickability. This is persevering and finishing a job of work that needs to be done. And of course, many people give up. They give up halfway through or any way through, or sometimes they don't even take on the challenges that they need to. So persistence is critically important in terms of motivation. So that's the second dimension. Now, the third dimension is the level of intensity that people put into the job. So some people, of course, don't meet deadlines because they take so long getting things done. They might take a long time to get reports done or whatever. So when you think about motivation, think about it in terms of the direction that people give, the persistence or stickability, and also whether how intense they are in terms of actually doing the job. So those are the three things that are critically important. So my comment to you is that the next time you feel that somebody's demotivated, instead of just making a blanket statement and saying they're demotivated, the bigger question is, which of those dimensions are being violated? And you might say all three, but it's likely that it'll be one or two. And then, of course, as a leader, you can focus in on those things and make a difference. All right, so that's motivation, that's the level. Has anyone got any questions, any comments, any observations about that definition or the three dimensions that come from that definition? If you do, go to the question box and I'd be happy to hear what you've got to say about that. Now, let's talk about some of the myths around motivation, some of the inaccurate statements that are made, and I think we need to clear the deck on this before we start looking at some of the things that people want out of their job. So one of the first myths about motivation is that, and it's a really important one because I suffered from this when I was working in the corporate world as a manager. You and I cannot actually motivate anybody. All we can do is to create the right environment, and it's ultimately up to the individual whether or not they decide to be motivated or not. Now, this is an important distinction because if you believe that you can actually create motivation in people, then you're going to be you're going to be disappointed, basically. All you can do is to create the right environment, right? This isn't a play on words. Ultimately, and a good example of that might be that two people may go to a workshop or a seminar. One person comes out and says they're all fired up, and the other person comes out and says they didn't enjoy it. Yet they were both exposed to the same speaker, the same stimuli, and yet one chose not to be motivated and the other one chose to be motivated. That's an example of what I mean. So it's all about creating the right environment for people to be motivated. The second myth about motivation, it's a bit of a generalization more than a myth, and that is that everybody ultimately is motivated. Just getting out of bed this morning is motivation. And so when we look at some of the people in our workplace and think, well, that person's not very motivated, at the end of the day, everybody to a certain degree is motivated, but not everybody is inspired. So maybe the work that people are doing, they don't necessarily find inspiring, but if you talk to them, in the lunchroom or wherever, you're quite amazed at some of the interests and so on that they have, and that can make a big difference. I've just got Jay just says, can I suggest that the myth therefore is that you can motivate people? It's a myth because you can only provide the circumstances. Yeah, thanks for that distinction, Jay. Yeah, exactly. So you're right, and maybe I'll change the slides to reflect that. But ultimately, you obviously get what I mean, Jay. So thank you for that distinction. Appreciate that. So, everyone to a certain degree has a level of motivation. It's just about whether they're inspired or not. Third point about this is that it's entirely subjective. And what I mean by that is that what motivates you or me, whoever, bottom line is it may not necessarily motivate other people. This is a very elusive topic. Motivation changes in our career lifespan as well. Motivations can change significantly, and the only thing that I can suggest to you there is that you need to listen to people and you need to try to work out what makes them tick, because I've seen manager after manager try to motivate people, or at least create the circumstances by which they become motivated by the things that motivate them. So for example, I like a challenge. I love challenges. I thrive on those opportunities. But I also know that when I give people challenges, often people wouldn't actually be inspired by that challenge. It made me realize that maybe there were other things that they were motivated by. So motivation is very subjective, and it basically requires you to listen to people and understand where they're coming from. Another concept that is important to share with you here is that intrinsic motivation is much more powerful than extrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic motivation, in meaning internal versus ex meaning outside. Organizations spend lots and lots of time, effort, and energy creating extrinsic motivational forces. It might be to meet deadlines, meet KPIs, give people incentives, and so forth. All of those things I'm not suggesting aren't important, but the bottom line is that what we're trying to do is to get people to bring their hearts and minds to work with them. And ultimately, that's an intrinsic motivational force rather than an extrinsic. So we have found out, and we'll talk about this a bit further on, that the good old carrot and stick, reward and punishment, that type of approach, doesn't work very well with the people that probably you lead. It works quite well in semi-skilled and unskilled environments, but it doesn't work very well with what we might call knowledge workers. So we need to try to tap into people's intrinsic motivation wherever possible. This one is a little controversial, and be happy to hear your comments about this, but I'm making the comment here that money is overestimated as a motivational force. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that money's not important. Obviously, if everyone stopped paying everybody in the workplace tomorrow, it's likely that your people either would come to work complaining or they wouldn't come to work at all. So to a certain level, money's important, but beyond that level, it doesn't make much difference. Now, research has demonstrated this. The work of Hertzberg has demonstrated that if you pay people a threshold income, just by increasing that threshold income won't necessarily increase a person's motivation. And I'm sure you'd be aware, I'm sure that's kind of common sense, although not always common practice. So in other words, if you doubled everyone's salary tomorrow, if you could, would that mean you'd get double the effort? Well, potentially you could in the short term, but it's probably not likely to be something that will be sustained. So we need to be aware of that, and I'd be keen to hear what you've got to say about that. Of course, money, don't get me wrong, the key word in that statement is overestimated. It's not the word money. And I think people talk about money a lot, rightly so. It does a lot of great things, and obviously it's a survival tool and so forth. But ultimately, money's not the answer necessarily above and beyond a certain threshold to motivate people, or at least to create the environment by which people become motivated. All right, so I'd be interested if you've got any comment about that. If I could sum all of this up, I would make this statement, and that is that if people are motivated by a principle which we call pain and pleasure. What I mean by that is that people do everything in life, and I mean everything, for two reasons ultimately. One is to avoid pain, and the other is to seek pleasure. So every single thing we do. So if you got out, you get out of bed in the morning, you may get out of bed in the morning because you can't wait to get to work. You're excited about the challenges that work might have for you. But on the other hand, you might get out of bed because you're fearful of the consequences of not getting out of bed in the morning. So in other words, the big issue there, it sounds very simple as a principle, but the big issue there is that every single one of us conceptualize pain and pleasure differently. So what's painful for one person may not be for someone else, or what's pleasurable for one person may be construed as pain. So in other words, the complicated part of that principle is the fact that everybody sees pain and pleasure in different ways. I've never wanted to rob a bank. I just would imagine that it'd be too painful to get caught, frankly. But I imagine that there are many people that would probably thrive on that challenge. There'd be some people who would probably say that it's painful not to be part of the gang that's going to rob the bank and not part of that peer group. So we all conceptualize those things differently. So where have we come from so far? We've defined what motivation is, and we've talked about some of the misunderstandings around motivation. So let's move on and let's start talking about what people want out of their job. Now you can see down the bottom that this is a relatively recent survey, 2018, and it was conducted by the Boston Consulting Group. Now the Boston Consulting Group interviewed, as I said earlier, 9,000 people, and they were across all industries, 21 industries in fact. They covered government, non-government, and not-for-profit. And it was a simple question that was asked of those 9,000 people. The simple question that was asked is, what is the one thing that you want most from your job? Not the job you've currently got, but any job. And so what the researchers did is they collected all that information, which was ultimately a frequency survey, and they identified what the top 10 things were that people wanted in their job. So it's quite interesting to have a look at those. Before I put anything up, I'm going to sort of see if you can guess what number one is. Would anyone like to just go to your question box and type in, what do you think number one was amongst people? Let's have a look and see what people say. It's always interesting to see this. Let's have a look and see what people have said. So Jay says purpose. Danny says recognition. By the way, both of those are on the list. They may not necessarily be number one, but you're absolutely right. Jason says fair play, the principle of fairness. That's on the list too. So well done. Anybody else? Danny adds another one there saying satisfaction. Another one says a sense of belonging. David says a sense of belonging. Yes, look, you haven't nailed what number one is ultimately, but what you've actually done is you've identified many things on the list. And of course, those things are on the list. So let's have a look at what's actually up there on the list. So thank you for your contributions. That's great. Now, number one on the list, believe it or not, is the capacity to be flexible at work. And I think if you'd asked people 20 years ago, this may not be the case, but we're all living in a busy environment. And I think many of us, we've got two people working. If we're in a relationship, both people are flat out. We've got kids to raise. We've got things to attend to. And people want to be able to have this flexibility in a job where they can attend to a whole range of things and keep all of these balls juggling in the air. So this was number one. Remember, this isn't this isn't me talking here. This is the 9,000 people that Boston Consulting Group interviewed. So number one was work-life balance. So that's interesting, isn't it? The capacity to be flexible in your work. Number two, and this is important, and I think people were alluding to this in their responses, their relationships or the quality of their relationships with their colleagues considered to be critically important. Their relationship with you as a leader, their relationship with their team members, their relationship with other people. Now, you'll note it doesn't talk about personal relationships. It's talking pretty much about working relationships. So to be working in a respectful, dignified environment is what the second thing was on the list. So that becomes number two on the list. That was the second most frequent response. Number three on the list, there was a distinction made between colleagues. Sorry, I didn't mention this earlier. There's a distinction between colleagues and managers. So people wanted to have a good working relationship with their manager. And of course, this has got huge implications for you and me, because ultimately it means that if we can actually improve our working relationship with the people that we lead, and the emphasis there is on working relationship, it's likely that we will satisfy one of the needs that people have. Now, you might recall in the last unit we looked at, the homework that I gave you was to set up regular check-ins with each of your direct reports. And this is important because by doing that on a regular basis, what you're actually doing is you're going to build trust levels up, you're going to build rapport up, you're going to build understanding up, and ultimately what you're going to do is to improve the quality of the working relationship with each direct report. So that's one of the reasons that I suggested to you to apply the 5 conversations framework or whatever it was that you might apply in those regular check-ins. And remember, those regular check-ins aren't chit-chat, but on the other hand, they're not necessarily specifically focused on a project that the person's working on at the time. So it's ultimately about people's development and people's performance. And that's why if you're a bit lost about what you're going to talk about in these check-ins, or you think they will just descend to talking about work or work situations, then use the 5 conversations framework I shared with you in the last unit. Number 4 on the list was that people want to feel appreciated. And of course, one of you mentioned this about recognition. I think we had, so Danny talked about recognition, and I guess people just want to feel that they're appreciated. They don't want, they're not suggesting for a minute that they don't want to be, they don't want you to communicate when they're not doing it right. They're not saying that, but what they're ultimately saying is that they just want to be appreciated for the work that they do. This is a relatively easy thing to do. Just by giving people praise at the right time, giving people positive feedback, just simply saying thank you to people can often make the big difference. And it's not to be underestimated because it's number 4 on the list. So obviously this is what people collectively have decided that they think is critically important. And I'm sure you're aware that in the world of work, there is not a huge amount of appreciation, or certainly not enough, not as much as there could be. And I think as a leader, you've got to be aware that this is very, very important. You've still got to be authentic with people, but ultimately they want to know that you appreciate the work that they're doing. Number 5 on the list is financial stability of the employer. Now that probably won't surprise any of you, and this would have probably been likely to be critically important to both public sector and private sector. And of course, some people will work in the public sector for that job security. It's a big factor because obviously people have got mortgages, they've got things that they've got to attend to. People have got expenses they've got to furnish, and so financial stability is very, very important for a person's consideration of a job, because obviously if they lose their job, they're going to lose their livelihood, albeit for a short period of time. Number 6 on the list, and this is very closely aligned with number 5, I think, is that they want a sense of job security. Now, nobody could be promised a job for life, and perhaps we could argue that there's no such thing necessarily as job security, but people don't want to feel that they're walking on eggshells and that at any moment they could be asked to leave for whatever reason. They want to feel a sense of security in the work that they do. So in some senses you can, and obviously if people are performing at a reasonable level, you can do that, but if they're not, then they may be creating their own circumstances of job insecurity rather than security. Number 7 on the list is people want interesting work. Now, the people in the survey, and I've read the report on this, they're not suggesting that they feel that every single thing that they do in the workplace needs to be interesting. I mean, after all, a lot of the work that we do is drudgery. Let's be honest, everything, not everything we do, but a lot of the work we do is drudgery. It's routine, it has to be done. Everybody understands that every job has got some degree of drudgery involved, but they also want to be assigned interesting projects if and when the opportunity arises. And that's ultimately what they're saying in the survey. And again, you've got a lot of control over that if the opportunity arises for that to occur. So that's number 7 on the list. Number 8 on the list is people want to feel as if they're growing and developing as an individual. And so training and development is extremely important. People want to feel that they're developing themselves, that they're given the opportunity to be better at what they're doing, because it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if people have got that, if the people can improve their skill set, their mastery, then what it actually does is gives them a sense of job security. Perhaps it might give them the opportunity to work in more interesting work and so forth. So that's number 8 on the list. Number 9 on the list is they want to know that the values of the employer are legitimate. They want to feel that they're working for an employer whose values align with their own values. And you only have to look at the global financial crisis and some of the large financial firms in the United States, such as Enron, that clearly were practicing unethical behaviour. And I think that the GFC did create a very strong need for people to feel that they're working for an employer that they can trust, that they know are basically their heart's in the right place. Again, I think if we were doing this 25 years ago, you'd probably find that that wouldn't be anywhere near as high on the list. Number 10 on the list is people want to feel as if they can develop their career. And of course, for some of you, that's not an easy thing to be able to provide, because there may not be a career ladder in your workplace, but you can certainly give them opportunities to learn and develop in their role, despite the fact that there may not be a sort of a rung up the ladder and another opportunity. You can give them, interesting projects to work on. You can stretch their capability and so on. So ultimately, folks, there's the 10 things. Now, what I'd like to do is ask you, as a leader, looking at that list of 10 things, let me ask you for a moment to put yourself in the shoes of these as an employee. And in many respects, you may well see yourself as an employee anyway. And I'd like you to identify which of those 10 things do you think is the most important to you. And I'd like you to write it in the question box. Just go to the question box. Which of those 10 things, you could just put the number down. You don't have to type the whole thing out, and it'll just give us a sense of who's in the room and what people think. So which is the most important for you in your current job? Is it 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10? Or are there a couple of things there? Or perhaps it might be that none of the things there are the ones that you would have identified. So let's have a look and see what people have said. We've got a couple of ones that have come up here. So Jason says job security is important to him. Okay, that's good to know. Jay talks about relationship with the manager as critically important. It's an interesting point you make, Jay, because what's actually happened is that when people leave work or leave their place of employment, it's often the case that they're leaving because they've had a very poor working relationship with their manager. Of course, they don't normally say that's the reason they're leaving, because that puts them into a vulnerable position. But what actually happens is that people will leave the manager rather than the organisation. So, of course, you can't have brilliant relationships with every person that you work with, but obviously you've got to do everything you can to try to improve the working relationship, because ultimately it's very important. So thanks, Jay, and I'm glad you agree on that point. All right, so there it is. Now, of course, some of those things you can do something about, and there are other things there you can't do anything about. I get that. But the point is, at least it gives you a bit of a heads up about a generic list of things that you need to do that's based on a very large sample of people, that will help to create the right environment for people to make the decision about whether or not ultimately they become motivated or inspired. So there's the list. All right, so let's move on. And I've got a little question here for you, and I'll give you the answer as well. But if you had one person who's just not motivated, nearly, if you've got 5 or 6 people in your team, it's probably likely throughout the course of this broadcast you're thinking of this one person. So what do you do? What do? You've got one person that's very, very, maybe they're difficult, maybe they just, they do the bare minimum, nothing more than no discretionary effort. It was just what's required of them, and even then, sometimes that's a battle. Well, here's what you do. You ask them. You have a meeting with them, you have a check-in, you sit down with them, and you ask them. So what do you ask them? So what would you ask them? Well, this would be the question that I think you could ask. You could say this to them. Now, you may not get an answer you want, but it's worth asking the question, is it not? Because perhaps nothing else has worked and you've tried several things and you're getting a bit frustrated and wanting to tear your hair out. How about you ask this question? Is there anything that I'm doing or not doing that can help you be more engaged in your work? Now, that is a good question, because ultimately, you're taking responsibility to a certain extent. And what you're trying to do is to get them to come up with and give you some sort of an indicator about how you might lead that person better. It's worth a try. And I found that sometimes, when this is done, the person on the end of it may not be able to give you an answer straight away, or perhaps doesn't want to give you an answer straight away. So what you do is you simply say, well, look, can I leave it with you? I'd be keen to get together with you at some point. I'd be interested to know. Can you give that some consideration, please? You just ask them the question. And then, of course, you follow it up. Now, that's one way. May not be always work, but it's certainly a good starting point in that process. All right, so let's just change tack here a little bit, and let's talk about this concept of the non-job roles that I'd mentioned early on, and let's just think about this for a minute and how that might operate and how it might work. So let me build this model up for you, and again, ask questions, and here we go. So you've got job role. Now, the job role is ultimately tied up in the job description. So this is the technical skills that people are required to do their job. So normally what happens is that people have got a job description and there's a whole range of things that they're supposed to do. Now, clearly that's important for performance, obviously. But I want to also alert you to the fact that there is another dimension in performance that's often not spoken about in the workplace. And let me build that up and share it with you. The other dimension is the non-job roles dimension. So these are things that are not necessarily written on the job description, but nevertheless are important for people's success at work. Now, researchers have been working on this for the last 30 years, and they've sort of tried to work out, they've always talked about non-job roles as important in performance, but they could never come to an agreement of a generic set of non-job roles that fit every single occupation on the planet. So in one of my books, as you can see at the bottom, I had a go at this, and I actually identified 4 non-job roles that I think are critically important in the public sector, the private sector, and not-for-profit. So let's actually have a look at what they are. And they aren't necessarily in any order. The first non-job role that I think is really important is having a positive attitude and enthusiasm. Now, by saying that, I'm not expecting people to bounce off the walls when they come to work. That's unrealistic. It's obviously not likely to happen. But I don't also expect people to be backbiting, whinging, complaining, being problem-focused rather than solution-focused. That's not exactly what I'm expecting from people, and nor should you. And I'm sure you know of examples in your own workplace of people doing that. And people that do that create a problem, because not only are they not exhibiting this non-job role, they're also contaminating your team, and they're dragging the whole tone of the conversation down. But because it's not written on the job description, we kind of are a bit concerned about confronting people about that. Now, I'm not suggesting you walk up to people and tell them that they've got to improve their rotten attitude. All that's going to do is create more problems. But at the same time, could you find some critical incidents where people perhaps could have done things differently or could have thought differently about what they're doing? So, for example, if somebody in a meeting, you've just had a meeting and a person has actually made 3 negative comments in the meeting, regardless of the value of those comments, you might want to pull them aside and say, look, I just noticed that you made 3 contributions in the meeting, and all of those contributions were problem-based rather than solution-based. And I've got a problem with that because I'm trying to develop a team which has got an upbeat attitude, and I'm finding that those things are not necessarily helpful. So could I just ask you to think about that? Now, they might argue that what they said was factually correct, but that's not what your comment is. Your comment is that they've actually started talking about, problems rather than solutions. So that's one non-job role. Another non-job role that's critically important is the team role. We expect people to operate in teams, and because the organisation is not as hierarchical as it once was, we're expecting people to operate in a team environment, to be a team player. Well, it might be the simplest way of putting it. But again, how often do you hear people saying, I'm not a team player? I come to work, I do my job, I go home. Well, that's all well and good, but the reality is that by not being a team player, they're actually, they're not actually being as productive as they could. So it's non-negotiable. We actually want people to be team players. We expect them to be, but again, this role is not usually listed on the job description. And ultimately, what happens is when people are exhibiting non-team behaviour, it becomes more difficult to pull them up. But again, you can use critical incidents to do that. The third role that is important is what I might call a career role. We expect people, or we should expect people, to grow and develop on the job, in the job. We expect, in other words, if you don't develop your skill set, what happens is you actually end up going backwards because the world's moving so quickly, everyone's moving on, and you'll be left behind. So this is not just about you as the leader, it's also about them and their own careers. So we're looking for people who are wanting to grow and develop and strengthen their capabilities. But again, how often do you hear people say, oh, I don't want to go to that training, I'm too old, or send someone else because I'm just happy doing my job here? Well, those things, of course, are only going to be detrimental to the employee, but ultimately, but also they're going to be detrimental to the team as well. So people working on themselves and developing themselves, in my view, is an important non-job role. But again, it's not usually written on that work document we call a job description. Now, the last one, and I'm not suggesting that there's only 4, I'm giving you 4 that you can start to work with. The last one is innovation and continuous improvement role. We should expect that people will come to work looking at ways of making the workplace more efficient and effective. Now, some of the people you lead may think that's your job, that's what you get paid for, but I don't believe it is your job. I mean, to some degree it is, but of course it's everyone's job. And what we're trying to do is to get people to bring their ideas to work, and often people don't do this. I think one of the reasons they don't do it is because they're not being asked. And you might recall that in the 5 conversations framework I went through last time we met 2 weeks ago, I talked about the last conversation, which was an innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So why not have a conversation with people about that? Why not use one of your check-ins as an opportunity to talk about that? And ask people, forewarn people, so that when they arrive, they've actually thought through their idea. Because of course, if you start a check-in and people are blindsided, and you ask them about ways and means of making the workplace more efficient and effective, they might give you a very strange look and they might be put off guard. So give them a chance to think about that before they arrive in your working, for the check-in. So whereas the last non-job role is about the workplace, the third one, which is the career role, is about the individual. So you could virtually say that if all 4 of those non-job roles were actually happening in your workplace, plus the fact that on the other dimension that everyone's got good technical skills, it's likely that your performance is going to improve dramatically or will be very high. But I would encourage you to have conversations with people on the dimension around the non-job roles. Don't just stick to the job description. Actually talk to them about the non-job roles as well, because ultimately it makes all the difference. Imagine if all of your team had a negative attitude. Imagine if all your team were individuals and didn't want to work in a team. Imagine if your team stopped growing and developing as individuals. And imagine if your team weren't prepared to offer suggestions for making your workplace more efficient and effective. Can you imagine the impact that's going to have? Obviously, it's going to be very negative. It wouldn't matter what skill set they've got. If those 4 things aren't actually happening in your team, it's going to create a problem for you. So that's why I'm sharing this with you. So don't just focus on what's on the job description. Focus also on what isn't in the job description, and that is these 4 things. And I hope you realise that they're critically important to success. Does anyone have any comment or question that they'd like to ask? While you might be thinking of that, I'm not suggesting for a minute that these are the only 4. All I've tried to do is come to terms with what might be some of those things, so that you can actually start to look at those things in your own workplace. I'm imagining that they're all applicable in your own workplace. I would also imagine that some of them are violating them and some of them are probably taking them on board. So there's a little framework that might help you in terms of getting the very best from the people you lead. All right. Okay, I'm assuming because there's no comment. Aha, here we go. Let's see what's being said there. All right, so non-job roles are great things to think about during recruitment. Thank you, Jason. I think this is a very good point that you make, that when we recruit people, what we tend to do is stick to the things that are on the left-hand side, don't we? So what we tend to do is we ask questions around people's competencies around the job roles. And how often is it true that 3 months into their probation, we think they're a pain in the neck? And if I just ask some questions around the non-job roles, I may have got a better sense of who that person was and how, suitable or unsuitable they were for the workplace. So that's a great observation, Jason. And I would encourage all of you, when you're interviewing people for jobs, you don't just ask people the questions that relate to their technical skills. But it's surprising how often that's the case. And of course, people don't get a sense of, the non-job roles that people might bring to the new role. So thanks, Jason. Now, let me share with you a couple of models around that might be useful. We're getting towards the end of our presentation. Abraham Maslow was an industrial psychologist who was around in the 1930s. Very famous, particularly for one particular model that he put together, which was referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you've seen it before, and it's on your screen, obviously. Maslow actually drew this on a napkin in a restaurant, and he was quite amazed, apparently, at how incredibly popular it became. But I think one of the reasons it was very popular is because it made a lot of sense to most people. The model is very simple. It's simply saying that every individual is motivated by a series of needs, and once that need's been fulfilled, it's no longer a need for that person, that there is a higher level need. So the fundamental need that we all have at the bottom of the apex there is physiological. All of us, our fundamental need in life is air, food, and water. So without air, food, and water, of course, we're not interested in anything else. That is survival 101. Now, the good news, living in a sophisticated society that we are in Australia, the majority of people that come to work have got those things sorted out. So that's no longer a need. It's no longer a motivator because those things have been catered for living in a first world country. The second need that Maslow talks about once the physiological need has been met is the safety need. But by safety, people need to feel that they're going to be physically and psychologically safe at work. And hence, we've got safety measures at work, and rightly so, but we've also got anti-bullying and harassment type of policies and procedures in the workplace. So the very first thing that people want to feel when they're in the workplace after they've obviously been nourished with air, food and water is they want to feel that they're working in a safe environment. Now, ultimately, once that need's been met, the next big need is that they want to feel as if they belong. They want to feel as if they belong and can make a contribution. So any new person that works in your team ultimately wants to know that they're going to fit in and be able to make a contribution. So that's a very important need that often gets overlooked because people are anxious about that. They've got to fight their way into the team. They've got to find their place, if you like. So a simple practical example would be if you've got a new member of your team is to actually ask them very early in their employment what they think the organisation's doing well and what they think the organisation's not doing well from their observations. And that's a very smart thing to ask because that obviously gives them a sense of belonging, that they have a value there. Once people feel they belong, they then need to feel that they have a say, that what they want to achieve is recognised. And that's where recognition is very important. So we need to be able to spend time listening to people. We need to give people recognition. We need to actually let them know that we value them. And you'll notice that previously those things came up largely in the survey. Now, if those things have been fulfilled, the next big need at the top of the apex is what Maslow actually called self-actualization. Self-actualization, which was the correct term, refers to somebody needing to feel as if they can grow and develop and be challenged in the work that they do. Now, some of you in this series, Lunch and Learn series, are probably at the top of the apex. hence your motivation to go and do this particular program. But don't make the mistake of thinking that everybody in your team is at the top of the apex. They may well be, but it's probably likely that they're not. So don't neglect the belonging and the recognition needs. There's the areas that Maslow says are the ones that are the most likely to be missing in the workplace. And hence you saw the comments from the 9,000 employees earlier. Another model I want to share with you is McGregors Theory X and Theory Y. Now, it's a very busy slide, and of course you'll get a copy of these slides, but if you look at the left-hand side, you can see that a Theory X manager is a manager that believes that human beings ultimately dislike work. They can't be trusted. They need to be forced to do work. They need to be motivated by fear, and they're not very creative, and basically they just need to be told what to do. Now, so the reason why McGregors theory is very important is that your basic assumptions about human nature will drive a lot of your leadership behavior. So if you are a Theory X manager, it's likely that people will find it extremely distressing working for you. In other words, they will probably find you a micromanager, an autocrat, and somebody that's not very interested in the people that they lead. On the other hand, if you look at the Theory Y manager, they're the exact opposite. These are people that believe that people, fundamentally, need to work. They're self-directed. They will thrive on responsibility when given prudent responsibility. They're motivated, and they can be highly creative under the right circumstances. Now, one of the criticisms, of course, of this model is it's very simplistic, and many people would say, well, hang on a minute, I'm probably a bit of X and a bit of Y. But I'll guarantee to you that you've worked in your career, and if you haven't, you will. You have probably worked for a Theory X manager. I certainly have, and it's not very pleasant. It's not a pleasant experience because they're always second guessing you. They're always looking over your shoulder. There doesn't seem to be a semblance of trust there, and it's just very difficult. Now, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So my suggestion to you is that if you adopt that Theory X approach, no matter how right you think you are, it's hardly likely to lead to intrinsic motivation. Theory Y managers is of course the way to go. Okay, now just before we wrap up, and if you've got any other questions, I'd like to hear them. But one of the best books that I've read is a book called Drive: The Inconvenient Truth About Motivation by Daniel Pink. And in the book, in essence, what he says is that the carrot and the stick, and you can see a cartoon of that on your screen, he argues that extrinsic motivation is not very effective when it comes to working with what we might refer to as knowledge workers. And he argues that we need a new approach to get the very best from the people we lead. He argues that there are three things that we need to do in our workplace. And the reason I like this framework is it's just so easy to remember. He argues that if you are ultimately looking for something to get the best out of people, give them a sense of freedom and autonomy to make their own decisions. Now, obviously, that's not everything. You need to be across what people are doing. But ultimately, giving people a sense of discretionary decision-making around how they do things, how they go about their work, and obviously it's the antithesis of micromanaging. So he argues that that's really important because knowledge workers usually are knowledge workers because they want some sense of freedom and autonomy. Somebody perhaps that might be working in a production line or something like that doesn't necessarily need autonomy, but somebody working in a knowledge environment often does need a sense of freedom. He also argues that they need a sense of mastery, and mastery is, of course, the ability to learn and grow and develop as an individual. So it becomes important, and that's why these check-ins are important. So it gives people an opportunity to bounce ideas off you and work with you. They also need a line of sight between what they're doing and the end game. In other words, they need to understand that the work that they do is actually making a contribution. So it's very, very important that people get a sense that this mindless report that I'm doing, or this boring meeting, or whatever it might be, is ultimately important, and that there needs to be some justification for it. So what that implies is you as a leader have to explain to people ultimately what the end result is that you're aiming to achieve. So what is the purpose? Why are people doing what they're doing? Don't assume that people know. This is what Simon Sinek calls the why of work. And ultimately, it's about creating a sense of purpose in the work that people do. So let's all bring this together, folks, before we wrap up. Whoop, there we go. It's coming up on your screen now. There we go. So let's say there are 9 things that you can do. So this is a summation of everything we've done today, some practical things. Let's go through and look at each of them. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but you need to clarify the job, the task role. So people need to be very crystal clear about what they're expected to do. So spend a bit of time making sure that you're briefing people correctly about what they're doing. You need to give people feedback, and guess what? We spent a whole session on that. So feedback, again, is critically important. You need to show people how they can make a contribution, and this is the purpose that Daniel Pink talks about in the previous slide. So give people a sense of purpose. Encourage people to set their own goals, which again is around autonomy. Try wherever possible to give people interesting work by matching their job with their personal motives. You can't always do it, but it's good when you can. Make apparent the personal gains that people make. And again, what this is feedback. Recognise individual success. Try wherever possible to remove organisational blocks. And I say wherever possible because some of them are very difficult to remove and may not be removed, but do what you can to try to help with that. And ultimately remove any supervisory roadblocks. These are the roadblocks that are within you. And of course, practice some of the things that we've learned today and have an honest look in the mirror occasionally and work out what you might be doing or not doing that's actually leading to an environment that's not as motivating as it could be. Folks, any questions before we finish? All good? Okay, so I'm giving you some homework to do, and the homework is that to go out of here and this afternoon, I want you to practice using the concepts of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So try whatever you can to try to bring these 3 things into play in your working environment. And by doing that, according to Pink, you are creating an environment where people can make a choice about becoming intrinsically motivated. So in other words, by creating the right environment, those people may choose to exhibit intrinsic motivation. So folks, that's it from me. So no questions. So thank you for all your contributions today. It's been great working with you again. I wish you a really great weekend. And, have a go this afternoon of applying some of these things that you've learned. And you'll find that you'll get some great results. And next time we meet, we'll look at the second last session, which is understanding people and their personalities. So thanks everyone, and I wish you all the best. Have a great weekend. See you later, and goodbye.